welcome. I must say that there are so many foreign words in the title that I probably would not know how to pronounce them. So just read the title of the talk. And I only can introduce Jan Hajič Jr., that much I know, and welcome you for the talk. And I think we will learn a lot during the talk, at least to read the title of your talk. So thank you.
Good afternoon. It is my mission so that, yes, you will be able to read and understand the title, and perhaps even a little bit more. So first of all, I feel I have to say that I'm here as the talking head for what has been a multi-year team effort. And you can see that there are a lot of disciplines involved. It is a good tradition of UFAL that we do interdisciplinarity, for a few decades by now. So I've taken the liberty to include some further fields into our purview. And the multidisciplinary framework within which this whole project is based is something called cultural evolution. And I want to talk a little bit about this because it actually might be interesting also for the linguistic side of our group, when we're looking for, catchy titles of projects and justifications of broader impact and stuff like that. Maybe this is a useful tool to have in our toolbox. So what is cultural evolution? Well, we have a super elegant theory that explains the diversity and change in forms of life, right? It's called evolutionary theory. It's been here for something like 150 years, and it has been extremely successful at figuring out why things live the way they do, why they're distributed the way they are, how it came to be that way, explaining away fossils to be part of the same process as bumblebees. I mean, it has been really one of the most successful scientific theories, giving us a grasp of what's going around us. And it all follows from just a few first principles. So heredity, and then there is some chance of mutation, and then there is the process of natural selection to some extent. I'm simplifying this a lot, but these are the first principles at play here. And basically, you can look at evolution as something that says, okay, this diversity of life can be explained by the processes of descent with modification. Gradually, we've come to understand this as genetic descent and now epigenetic descent, etc. The layers of detail keep coming up, but in principle, we still have this evolutionary idea of the process of descent with modification. Aren't these also kind of the principles that underpin the diversity and change in culture? Misusing this evolutionary analogy has brought a lot of pain in the 20th century. But in the 1970s and later, having learned from the misuse of evolutionary theory in the social sciences and humanities, the field of cultural evolution has come up, and it's basically asking the question, what are these first principles explaining the diversity and change in cultures? And I won't go into definition of culture. For now, the intuitive understanding of what culture is good enough. So what are some of the topics of cultural evolution? The most important one is transmission mechanisms. The whole field started with an observation that whereas in biological evolution, transmission is overwhelmingly vertical, so from parent to offspring. This is not necessarily the case for culture. So we have vertical transmission in families, little kids learn fundamental patterns from their parents. But also there is a lot of horizontal transmission, so across peer groups, oblique transmission from distant relatives in other generations and figures of authority, etc. So the transmission situation in culture is much more complicated than in biology. Now we know that in biology is also a bit more complicated than just, parent offspring, but in culture this is much more complicated. And cultural evolution looks at the socio-cognitive mechanisms that enter the fitness function. If we're talking about cultural selection, so what are the mechanisms by which we select successful variants of culture? Why is this song popular and not that one? Why is building boats like this more popular than building boats like that? There is a big area of gene culture co-evolution. So you cannot really separate the processes at the genetic level from processes at the cultural level. We have evolved lactose tolerance since we've cultivated cows. And the most interesting, or currently the most researched subfield of cultural evolution, is this idea of cumulative cultural evolution, and whether perhaps this mechanism is what makes humans so damn good at surviving and thriving in many different environments. Like, we can argue that we really have outcompeted nearly everything else on Earth. So what is the reason for that? What is our unique capability that maybe other species don't have? And one of the current working theories is this idea of cumulative cultural evolution, that we accumulate our culture to be progressively more and more successful and more adaptable to very different environments. And that through culture we are able to get these innovations in broad use quickly, broadly. Through social learning they spread everywhere, and over generations we add on to that. Like, language is a pretty good example, quite possibly, right? And a lot of cultural evolution is looking at whether cumulative cultural evolution happens in non-humans. And there is one of my favorite examples of what the field is doing is looking at this in the context of parrots in Australia. There's this very fun study which is working on how parrots defeat defenses of rubbish bins in a suburb of Sydney, and how they learn from each other, how humans learn from the parrots, innovate the bin defenses, like, sticking a plastic bottle there so that the birds cannot open it, because they can throw rocks down. This is a bit harder for them. And then the parrots figure out the defenses, and you look at the mechanisms, how neighbors learn from each other, as well as parrots from neighboring groups learning from each other. And you're looking for whether the parrots can successfully accumulate this knowledge, right, through social learning and intergenerational social learning. So this is a longitudinal study going on for the 4th year by now. And it's just a really fun read, too. And then there is applied cultural evolution, which takes this theory and uses it to understand existing observed cultural phenomena. And the premise of this is, if we understand the transmission process, this process of descent with modification, and if we get a formal model for this, then we can have a pretty plausible explanation of how this observed cultural diversity got there. And in some cases, maybe we can predict what's going to happen, but actually this is kind of a frontier in cultural evolution. The major criticism of the field from the side of like classical anthropology and social sciences and economics is that you guys haven't really come up with a useful prediction yet. And it's partly warranted, but already this is pretty cool. And there are multiple formal models for how to use this. So there is this phylogenetics, which we are going to use, which has actually been quite successful for historical linguistics. There are dynamic systems with ordinary differential equations, like solving, physics systems, looking for cultural attractor states in such ways. Agent-based models, which just simulate a large population of different agents behaving in different ways, and then you're looking whether, does prestige, if I turn up the knob of prestige bias, does the resulting distribution of, I don't know, book popularity look like what we actually have in our data, etc., etc. One of my favorite examples of applied cultural evolution studies is the understanding of the distribution of string figures globally. So do you remember přebíračka, kolívka, right? That's a global thing. Actually, the specific pattern that we know as přebíračka is really global. But there are also much more complicating things going on. I especially love the stuff from Inuit cultures, which is super complex, like the swan. The hair is really simple. The swan is kind of complex. And then and you get multiple animals on your fingers, and it's used as a storytelling device. So you're talking about, how the world around you works, and this animal eats that animal, and then you move your fingers, and really this animal eats that animal. It's like, this was one of the coolest presentations I have ever seen at a conference. And you can observe that, Polynesia is apparently doing its own thing, but otherwise these string figures are remarkably consistent globally, and the Inuits are doing their own thing. So we're gonna use this applied cultural evolution perspective to study our medieval music, Gregorian chant. So chapter 1, what is Gregorian chant? Why should we care? Why should you care? Who has never heard of Gregorian chant? Like, don't be shy. The normal thing is that like 60% people in the room raise their hand. So, okay, so a brief intro. So Gregorian chant is a musical tradition. It's vocal monody, which means you sing it and there is one melody. It's sung on Latin text. It's intimately connected to the Latin Church, which we now call Catholic, but for much of its history, you didn't have to say Catholic because the Protestants weren't around yet. The performance itself is liturgical. It's a ritual, leaving aside, concert performances today. For a big part of its life, this tradition has been oral, but we do have a lot of written records of this, and they're really quite beautiful. And some of them are really quite expensive. So this is what a page from one of these fancier liturgical books might look like. And there are records of the individual elements of this tradition, of the individual chants. You can look at them as compositions of sorts, but keep in mind that the term composition might not necessarily apply. And they are just ordered according to the needs of the liturgy. And this means like when you should sing what. This red stuff, this is called a rubric from the Latin rubrum, which is red ink. And this one, if you can read medieval handwriting, it's not that hard. It's kind of fun, but it takes a while to learn. This tells you that part is supposed to be sung in Vigiliam Assumptionis Beatae Mariae Virginis ad vesperas antiphon, which means, if you know liturgy, that it's supposed to be sung on the 15th of August after the sun goes down. Let me do just, for some imagination. I will try to sing this one so that you have some idea of what's going on, but please bear with me, it's not easy. Vidi speciosam sicut columbam, et eructabant eam flores rosarum, et lilia convallium. And then you would go on. There is a hint of how it goes on, etc. So this is one chant, right? There was a lot of them. And this was for a good reason, because when Charlemagne started off his Frankish Empire project, so he got crowned emperor by the Pope and he said, I'm the heir of the Roman Empire now. He deliberately used Gregorian chant as a way to mark the identity of his empire. So how do you communicate to a lot of subjects who maybe never heard about you that they are your subjects now? Well, they all go to church. What is the dominant, none of them know Latin really, but what is the dominant experience, the sensory experience of going to liturgy if you understand nothing from what is said? Is the music, right? So you shape the music, suddenly you're shaping the experience of religion. Religion is key to identity in the Middle Ages in Europe. So you're shaping the cultural identity of your subjects through prescribing some music. It's actually remarkably powerful. I did not understand this, how powerful this actually was until I got into what the medieval soundscapes were like and how poor they actually were. And chant was pretty much the only music that you got, except for the singing that you did yourself, right? And like folk music. So this remained the dominant auditory expression of religion for 800 years. And in a pretty unique situation compared to everybody else doing medieval stuff, is the tradition is really homogeneous across a huge area. So that chant which I sang is a thing that you can identify in a Polish manuscript, in a Spanish manuscript, in an Italian manuscript, in a manuscript later from colonial South America, and it's still very clear, oh, it's this chant. I know how it goes, it's like that. And there are some 30,000 extant manuscripts. This is a guesstimate. but as the best one we have. And the medieval production may have been as high as 1.5 million manuscripts. So Chant is really huge, and Chant is also digital. We have a database. For 40 years, people have been collecting things. Now there is something like 500,000 catalog records of, okay, this chant occurs in that liturgical position in this manuscript. Now people have been doing this for a while. Because just one chant database, when you can have more chant databases, there is now 19 of these. Altogether, none of them are as big as the Cantus database, which is the first one, but we now have more than 1 million records, which is pretty cool. You can imagine like this you can do computational work with. It's more than 500 full manuscripts because each manuscript consists of approximately 2,000-ish chants. And then there is a lot of fragments because not all of these books survive in completeness. And despite this idea of a homogeneous tradition and this shared identity, chant still is quite diverse internally. So you still have the unified liturgy, you have a unified auditory musical identity, you have all the rules and efforts to write down, okay, what you are supposed to sing exactly when, but there were always exceptions, right? There were so many exceptions throughout the Middle Ages. You can imagine how many exceptions there are. This means that within the Gregorian tradition, we have a lot of local variation and institutional variation is in what you're supposed to sing at which point in liturgy. And so there is quite a lot to study. There is this problem of internal sub-traditions. We actually don't know much about how notation systems developed in the early Middle Ages. We don't know much about performance practice. We don't really understand how its melodies are constructed. If there is a new saint today, which does happen, and they get a new feast, technically you're supposed to compose new chant in this tradition, but there is no rule book. There is no textbook on how to do that. We don't understand really how these melodies are constructed. So there's a lot of opportunities for computational musicology in Gregorian chant. And my favorite opportunity is the search for melodic dialects. So not repertoire subdivisions, but melodic subdivisions, different styles of Gregorian melodies within the big tent of Gregorian style. So to get into this, we have to understand that you really were supposed to remember melodies exactly. There was this whole tradition of the Holy Spirit singing them into the ear of Pope Gregory, and Pope Gregory dictates this, and this is why you really have to sing exactly that, because the melodies themselves are of divine origin. But you didn't really have the technology to transmit things very exactly. For 250 years, you didn't even have music notation that would record exact pitch. So you relied on memorization. It was quite a lot of work. It took 10 years to learn the repertoire. And even when you started having pitch notation and this timeline went down to 2 years or so, still manuscript copying is prone to errors, and you were not only copying, you were also actually writing the manuscripts down from memory. So it was really, really hard to transmit the melodies really quite exactly. So what we get is a situation where, even though it's clearly the same chant, the exact sequence of notes between two manuscripts is practically never quite the same. So this is all from one Christmas antiphon. And we can look at some sites of variation within the melodies, and we sort of can see that there are always differences, but some are quite similar to each other, right? Like B and C, for instance. So the question is there such structure within Gregorian melodies across time, across space, across the different ecclesiastical sub-institutions? Is there a meaningful diversity in the melodies? If you went to some other church and you listen to how they are singing, can you say, okay, they're singing in the Hungarian style here? The Hungarians would be super happy if this turns out to be the case. So this is one big research question that we have. Are there melodic dialects in Gregorian chant? Previous work has identified some, but as I'm sure everybody who has fought for corpus linguistics in the face of pre-corpus linguistics knows, this is not really based on very solid, replicable scientific methodology, right? I mean, the old Mark I eyeball can get you pretty far, but at this scale, it becomes fishy to just rely, on an expert sitting in a room for 10 years and just comparing things and writing them down. It works to a large extent, but not to this extent. And there is little we know about how these dialects actually correlate to historical circumstances. The previous work mostly defines them in national terms, but maybe there is actually nothing national about them. Maybe they are more connected with, okay, I have earlier manuscripts from France and later manuscripts from Germany. The correlate is actually time, but it looks like these are national dialects. Or it has nothing to do with the nation. It has everything to do with the institution of origin. So if you have, manuscripts from a particular order of monks, wherever they are, it's going to be super similar to each other and super distinct from wherever they are. So what are the historical correlates of these melodic dialects? This is a great fit for computational methods. Also, let's circle back to the idea that some melodies are more similar than others. Okay, B and C look the most similar here. Then D is probably closest. Then E, and then A has this really different start. So if you turn this 90 degrees, it kind of looks like some transmission history, right? If you've ever seen stematology in classical philology, you should be getting goosebumps right now. The spirit of Helmut Lachmann is in the room with us. But not entirely. We're going to do better than the Lachmannians. But maybe by looking at the structure of melodic diversity, we can recover the cultural networks that spread chant around Europe, and we can figure out who was in touch with whom. And this is like a shared layer of European identity at a time where pretty much nothing else than the church provided this. And in some ways, this still reflects this structure of a shared layer and regional identities is still kind of reflected in the Europe of today, right? Like there is such a thing as a common European identity. Can we perhaps trace the patterns of what is common and what is regional all the way back in the Middle Ages? Who knows? Maybe we can get this map of transmission. Okay, so the research questions recap. Do melodic dialects exist in Gregorian chant? If yes, what are their historical correlates? And stretch goal, can we perhaps trace the actual transmission history? I can sort of see where this is going, right, with the cultural evolution intro. And that is to chapter 2, which is a gentle introduction to phylogenetics. That's the weird word. Okay, so what are phylogenetics? They are tools for estimating the tree of life. More accurately, tracing evolutionary relationships between populations. Typically, the population is defined as a species. The concept of a species in biology is kind of ill-defined, but only kind of. It's a useful abstraction in many ways. But it also might be a subpopulation, right? You can study, for instance, the phylogeny of humans. We can learn quite a lot about how we got out of Africa by studying the phylogenetic trees on different human subpopulations. And in principle, all we need is this process of descent with modification, right? And cultural evolution theory says, yeah, I mean, culture kind of works that way too, where we inherit changes, but there is some modification, which can be random or which can be non-random. The random aspects are mutations, basically. The non-random aspects are selection. Whatever is the mechanism for selection, whether it is just subconscious biases like prestige or confirmation bias, it can be aesthetic intent when somebody is doing a deliberate redaction of a Gregorian melody. But this is abstracted as selection pressure. Okay. What is a phylogenetic tree? It kind of looks like this. Terribly sorry to everybody who's used to trees with the root up. Here we draw them with the root down. So time goes like this. This is a leaf. This is an internal node. This is what we're interested in. As opposed to, well, it's kind of like constituency parsing. We're interested in figuring out the internal nodes, right? But it's not constituency parsing, don't worry. Your state exam nightmares can go away. This is a branch. This is also a branch. With branches, we're mostly interested in how long they are, in the evolutionary distance that they reflect. This is a root, and we leave aside what roots mean in this case because it's complicated and not necessary. So how do you build a phylogenetic tree? The first idea is parsimony. So you use the tree that models differentiations towards the observed diversity with the fewest required changes in total. This is Occam's razor in evolution, right? The intuition is if two species look similar, it's more parsimonious that they share a lot of evolutionary history. Otherwise, some properties they have in common would have to evolve twice at different points in actual history, and that's an unnecessarily complicated explanation. There are phenomena that mess with the idea of parsimony, like convergent evolution, whatever. The basic idea is pretty sound. This, even though it's rudimentary, is already a useful abstraction, and there are computational methods to find parsimonious trees. So what does this look like? Okay, let's go back to our 4 little lizard species. We call them Alice, Bob, Carol, and Doug, and we observe some of their traits which distinguish them from each other. Like observing the dewlap for these 4 species, this thing on their neck, it's pointless. It doesn't help us distinguish them from each other. These things do help, right? So we know that Doug has tail spines. Doug and Carol have these marks on their side. Alice and Bob have horns, and additionally, Alice has this crest, there's the spikes on her back. Okay, so let's propose a tree. What if they evolved like this? Well, let's map how they evolved their traits. And this is 6 changes. So you can see that the horns had to evolve twice, right, for Alice and for Bob separately, and the marks had to evolve for Carol and Doug separately. So this is not a particularly parsimonious tree. Okay, let's try another tree. Let's try like this. Now we only evolve horns once, right? For Alice and Bob, they're both descendants of this new internal common ancestor. But if you fill it in, you still get 6 changes because Carol has to de-evolve horns, right? That's another change. Again, this tree is not more parsimonious than the first one. Let's try like this, or we swap it around. Okay, horns evolve here. Now we're getting somewhere. It's just marks that evolve twice, but we have only 5 changes, so it's slightly better now. Let's try it like this. Horns once, marks once, everything else once. We are at 4 changes, and there are 4 traits that had to evolve, so this is an optimally parsimonious tree. There can be multiple trees like that, but they will be all optimally parsimonious. Fortunately, we don't have to try all trees. There is a lot of them, right? You can probably guess. It's a really large number, n to the power of n-2, because we have n leaves, and we are looking at all possible trees with that many leaves. So it's even more than trees on n nodes. Fortunately, there's the neighbor joining algorithm that helps us get through this state space quite efficiently. So basically, we just infer a common ancestor for the species with most similar traits. If you remember mutual information clustering from statistical methods in NLP, this is basically a simpler version of that. I mean, I guess you could do this with mutual information as your distance metric. So we do neighbor joining, and look, Alice and Bob are the most similar. They share 3 out of 4 columns, and then Carol and Doug, etc., etc., etc. You build the tree. So far, we've been looking at what are called morphological features, but you can also do this with biological sequences. And there, instead of making tables of traits like this, you just align the sequences. You get something like this. So these are very, very tiny parts of the chloroplast gene of different pine trees. And the colored columns, those are completely uninteresting. But for instance, this column is an informative trait or informative position in the alignment because it helps us distinguish which species of pine share more evolutionary history with each other than others. Parsimony, though, has issues. For instance, the crest and the spine look super related, but evolving them is completely independent. under the parsimonious model, though not every change necessarily costs the same. And most importantly, there are statistical consistency issues. So, but not all evolutionary trees can be recovered with a maximum parsimony model. So parsimony is limited, and we will see that it actually is limited also in our Gregorian chant use case. And it's also really hard to say what branch length actually mean. So what we instead do is phylogeny with something called models of evolution, which actually makes the effort to think more about the transmission process. It's not just saying, well, the fewer changes, the better, but it's trying to model the actual probabilities of individual changes over time. So now we're getting, to the methods that we know and love, which are statistical methods. So, for instance, for DNA or RNA sequences, you just specify a 4x4 table of mutation probabilities, and then there are algorithms that can optimize this for a given observation. They can find the maximum likelihood tree. I won't go in, this will be a separate subject. And I don't understand that well. That's why I have a bioinformatician on the team. And the other thing you can do, maximum likelihood, you can do the real thing and you can go Bayesian. And instead of just looking for the most likely tree, there are methods to find the posterior distribution over trees given a model under a given model of evolution with a set of observed sequences. And this is actually pretty close to what we did earlier, right, with the worked example with our 4 lizards, because this is usually solved with Markov chain Monte Carlo, where you really just try trees and you have some mutation operators on those trees, and then you explore the posterior space over all possible trees, the topologies and branch length as well. Okay. I'm pretty sure you can see where this is going, right? So drum roll, please. Chant melody is just a different alphabet. Sequences with a different alphabet than, proteins or DNA nucleotides or something. The methods don't care. Well, they do care a little. There was a lot of programming involved. But in principle, the methods don't care what alphabet you throw there, as long as your data conforms to an evolutionary process that's in the assumptions of the phylogenetic model, so descent with modification, basically, you're fine. So what we do is chant phylogenetics, phylogenetic models over chant melody. Each manuscript, which is our unit of analysis, is like a species. So each manuscript is a lizard. Chants are like dinosaurs. Tell your kids. Each cognate melody, which is in the database with something called a cantus ID, which tells us, okay, yeah, this is the instance of the same chant in that manuscript and in that manuscript. So that works as telling you, okay, which segment of the melodic genome you should align across the different manuscripts, right? Like it says, this is the same gene. And we use the Volpiano encoding for the alphabet. So instead of the protein 20-character alphabet, we have Volpiano, which also has approximately 20 characters, but that's really random. There is no connection there. And we actually use the absolute pitches instead of relative pitches, even though melodic contours are more salient cognitively. For chant practitioners, which is who we care about, they were actually aware of which pitch they were singing. That's how the musical system worked. You had individual psalmization syllables assigned to different places in the melody within the medieval tonal system. You could actually point out on your hand, like I'm singing Pangelingva gloriosi. And you could, if you knew the Guidonian hand, you could sing along just from me showing you. The computing step is finding the optimal phylogeny. That's all we really need computers for, but we really need them. And if there is structure in melodic differentiation, if these melodic dialects exist, we should recover them, right? Because if we set our model of evolution right, which we can, then this principle of enhanced probabilistic parsimony kicks in. And it tells us, yeah, if the melodies are more similar to each other, they share more transmission history. So the method, we transcribe melodies from a bunch of manuscripts. We take care to transcribe melodies that correspond to the same set of cantus IDs, the colors. Then we run multiple sequence alignment. We steal this nice tool from the bioinformaticians. Well, we borrow. We do have to do a bit with the custom substitution model, but it's not much work. And then we get aligned melodies, where we get like really the positions in melody that should correspond to each other. And then we run the tree inference and we get our transmission structure. But wait, maybe chant transmission is not biological evolution. We really have to check whether the assumptions of the phylogenetic model hold. And this is where we get back into cultural evolution theory and thinking about transmission. So what do we need for phylogenetics model to be applicable? We need a process of descent with modification. We need homology. We need to have clear units to compare with each other. And we assume a tree structure. Let's check. How does chant relate to these assumptions? So we talk a bit about how the Gregorian tradition was actually transmitted across Europe, how this unification project and its sustenance worked over time. There was an originating environment, or that's what chant scholarship still kind of thinks, in the city of Metz, which is in eastern France, close to the borders with Germany. And there was a specific scriptorium, the Carolingian main scriptorium for Gregorian chant, which was the center from which manuscripts with just chant texts, because they had no way to record a melody, but where chants were written, from where they were distributed, where experts would learn how to sing this, and they would go and teach others across the Carolingian Empire. So this is the originating environment of Gregorian chant. It was disseminated via these trained practitioners and their manuscripts along the relationships between different ecclesiastical environments. So being a bishop was basically being, a feudal lord of sorts. Of course, there were family ties, so you would send your brother. If you're in Metz and you have a brother who's a bishop over there in southern France, you tell him, hey, come over, we'll pay for your travel costs. Then chant, you get a manuscript, just make sure that people sing the way they should in your diocese, etc. So you have this network spreading out from Metz. There was really little room for variation. You were supposed to remember the melodies exactly, and this applied to the shape of the melody itself. And we have multiple records of people in positions of authority correcting how others are singing. That there was, strict discipline very often with this. Yeah, you're doing it wrong. And this discipline is also documented by the actual development of exact pitch notation, right? Why would you spend so much extra space on pretty extensive parchment to write down the melodies if everybody could remember them exactly? Well, not everybody could remember them exactly. And it was important, so you spend money writing it down. How did this process of learning melodies actually work and teaching them further? So you go to a school, if you can, to become a cleric, and it's a pretty good life, all things considered. Typically, younger sons of noble families would go into ecclesiastical education because they would not inherit the fiefdom. But this was a way to make something of themselves, to have some social prestige connections, etc., etc. But also just regular kids went to ecclesiastical schools, especially if they were good singers. This was a way to get like social mobility, to become a cleric, if you were good at singing as a boy. For girls, this was not so applicable. There you learn Gregorian chant. It takes you 10 years to learn the 2,000 plus melodies. And you learn from a cantor, or perhaps you cross-reference with a manuscript, but if there is a bunch of people learning, they cannot all look at the same manuscript. So there was a lot of oral, actually like oral AU learning involved here. Okay, now you know this, maybe you stay in that place, maybe you become the cantor and teach the new guys down the road, or maybe you get sent to a new place because the medieval population was growing and the ecclesiastical institutions had a certain carrying capacity, they had to split up. So dioceses would split up, right? We got a new diocese in Prague in the 11th century, I think. Then it upgraded to an archdiocese and more dioceses came up. So you have more and more places that need to practice liturgy. That means you have more and more places that need singers, that need a book. So maybe you get sent to establish liturgy at a new place, a new diocese or new monastery or something. And sometimes you just die and you don't really transmit anything, but that's fine. Somebody else does this. So the picture that we get from chant transmission is this like Chinese whispers over years and decades of professional clerical life, of course. It's not like Chinese whispers in the room, but it is this process of, okay, I listen, I memorize, I practice this, now I know this pretty well, I teach someone else. The process of descent is clearly there, right? There is this vertical transmission going on, vertical not in the sense of familial units, but in the sense that there is a clear position of authority from which you learn. And then maybe you become the authority for someone else, etc. But at the same time, we know there was modification because we saw the variation in melodies. So there had to have been enough changes to produce the observed diversity. So descent with modification, check. We actually have we're fortunate to have a really good balance between the conservation and modification. If there was a lot of modification, the thing would be completely saturated, right? And the changes then would be random and would not tell us anything about shared histories. But if this happened, we wouldn't really be able to tell whether two melodies are really variants of the same chant melody. But we can tell this clearly. And from just observing the actual melodies, it's fine. It's not saturated. We do have homology. We have cantus IDs now indexing this, but also in medieval discussions about what you should sing when, it's clear that they knew, yeah, this chant or that chant. Do we have a tree structure? Well, we have Carolingian Metz as a sort of root environment, and we mostly have a single inheritance situation. So it's a tree, or it could be a tree. I mean, of course, there is some horizontal transmission going on. Some people go visit another place, learn how they sing, bring this information back, or just stay there and modify what's going on there. So, of course, this is not a perfect explanation for any and all historical circumstance, but it's good enough, hopefully, and we can measure it. So, mostly, I think, you should now be convinced that this phylogenetic model of chant transmission actually applies to the predominant historical realities of the time, and that we really can model this medieval tradition in the same way that we model, the dinosaurs and their relationships. So this is quite analogous, actually, to what we do with dinosaurs, right? Nobody saw dinosaurs reproduce. But we know something about the transmission process of genetic information, so we can infer something about the evolutionary histories of the fossils that we find, whether they are shared, to what extent. We can do stuff like timing, when did something diverge, etc. The same mechanism can be applied to this medieval musical tradition. The tree structure, of course, is the weakest point of this, but there are ways to measure tree likeness. So we can do also a post hoc check that our assumptions hold. Okay. This is a meta question that follows from this, and this is what we see once we actually examine the data. Can phylogenies actually be used for this kind of large-scale study of chant melody? A priori, we have many reasons to expect them to work, but of course, until you run the experiment, you never know. And actually, this was one of the main points of this project, to see what are the ways in which to convince musicologists that they really should listen to these corpus methods, and that we can tell them something useful with formal models and with cultural evolution theory. Okay. The experiments. Actually, you can find a medieval illumination for pretty much anything. So this is now going to be fast because now you know everything you need to know, and I can just do like the results section basically. So we have two data sets. One is from Christmas liturgy. This is a small one. We have just 6 melodies from 14 manuscripts each. It's something like 500 notes per manuscript. I did not expect that this would be enough. We have a second data set called introits, which is from a different type of liturgical book. So the Christmas data set is for divine office liturgy or hodinky, and this is more or less private. And introits are a genre of chants for the Mass. These are all taken from Sundays, so the introits dataset is from public liturgy, and we selected introits because they are sort of the public face of chant. And you even have Sundays that take their name from the first word of the introit that is sung. Like, you know, in Advent, the third Sunday is called Gaudete because the introit for that one starts with Gaudete, omnes, blah, blah, blah. In Lent, a week ago was called Letare because the introit was like that, etc. So the introits are really connected to the musical identity of liturgy. And this is a bit bigger. We have 23 manuscripts. We have about 2,500 notes from each manuscript. So in total, this is already more than 50,000 notes. And is it representative though? Because it's like, it's not 30,000 manuscripts. It doesn't cover all the 250 medieval dioceses, etc., etc. Well, it's not representative in that sense, but at least it has both types of liturgy. It has decent geographic coverage. So we have like different major regions of Europe, of Latin Europe covered. And model is extensible. So if it works on this, you can always transcribe melodies from a new manuscript and recompute the thing. We are mostly interested in whether the method gives us something useful. And it kind of does. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here. So this is the Christmas tree. What does it mean? So the manuscripts are placed on the map according to where they actually come from. The thickness is inversely proportional to branch length. So branch length is evolutionary distance. If it's a very thick branch, it means the evolutionary distance is very small. If it's a thin branch, it means the distance is long. I had to do this because the distances on the map, of course, constrain what I can draw. And the colors correspond to the ecclesiastical environment of origin. So these orange ones, these are just regular parish churches or cathedrals. And then there are different monastic or pseudo-monastic orders, like the Benedictine monks, which are the black ones, and the Augustinian monks, which is this pink one, and the Cistercian monks, which are these 3 blue ones, which are really closely related to each other. This is actually the topology if we just draw it off the map. The Cistercians are this really tightly grouped bunch, and this corresponds very well to historical reality because as opposed to pretty much everybody else, the Cistercians actually required you, if you wanted to make a new monastery, that you had to go back to France, to roughly here, and to copy your chant books from their authoritative exemplar. A part of this exemplar actually still survives in the library in Dijon. But the other monastic orders were not so strict about this, which is why we see the Benedictines sort of spread around geographically. And the rest of the tree is really structured according to place. What about the introits? Well, already you see some similarities, right? Again, there is this blue network of Cistercians who are super closely related. We know to expect that. This is what it looks like if we just look at the tree topology. And what other branches do we have? Here the picture gets confusing because there are too many manuscripts. So we have this olive branch, and it's olive because it goes to Italy. And it's these 2 manuscripts, and then it's this one, which is in Germany, but this is a manuscript from a Franciscan monastery, and the Franciscan order was founded in Italy. And this is a relatively early Franciscan manuscript, so it makes good sense that it's grouped with the northern Italian ones. Then we have this branch for southern France, with very clear geographical delimitation. We have this branch east of the Rhine, again, which is like this group. Just ignore the Cistercians, and then you see it's like the Bohemian stuff, and there is a Polish manuscript far off in the east. And actually look at this one. This is technically also Italy. So why is it not on the Italian branch? Because that part of Italy was actually under Habsburg rule by the time this manuscript was created. And the Habsburgs were up in Carinthia and Styria and those parts of Austria. So that's why this manuscript is like well placed in that branch. It actually tells us something. It tells us something about political geography being more important for melodic distributions than physical geography, which is something you do not necessarily get, for instance, in language differentiation, right? You have this kind of rule. I don't understand this too well, but I do remember that if you are in the mountains, you get small areas with their own languages because of reduced possibility of contact. At this layer of culture, apparently this mechanism no longer really works. The Alps are not an obstacle for chant melodies. Again, it makes sense, right? The way that ecclesiastical networks work, they can afford to travel, they are rich, they're much richer than the people who are speaking, Ladino and Romansh and whatever in the Alps. And there is also a region from the north of France, plus these two things from around Paris. And actually, remember that I said this is all Bayesian. So the tree you're looking at is the summary tree. It's the tree from the posterior distribution such that all the internal nodes have a probability of at least 50% under the posterior. And this node is just above 50%. So for instance, you shouldn't trust this particular common ancestor too much, right? Maybe, the evolutionary history around here is slightly different. We just don't know. Perhaps we don't have enough data to resolve this fully. And this also happens in biology, by the way, pretty often. Like there are ongoing problems with where to root angiosperms, so flowering plants within the phylogeny of plants in general. Actually, on this subject of trees, I said we can measure tree likeness. I've been showing you confident results from trees, but how tree-like are actual chant melodies? There is this nice method called delta plots, actually developed for language phylogenies. And it has been validated against simulated and real data to work quite well as a measure of tree likeness. And it's a prior measure of tree likeness. So you compute this from the alignment before you actually compute a tree. So this is like a gateway. It's a check you have to pass. Am I tree-like enough so that it makes sense to make a tree? For chant melodies, yes, it's actually as good as language data. The tree likeness for different data sets of language are in the same range in terms of delta plots as for chant melodies. It's actually better than folktale data on which phylogenies also have been applied and published. There isn't really a good interpretation scale for the delta plots. What you can do is compare to other existing works like this and see if you're like in the right ballpark. And actually, if you have problematic data from biology, like the angiosperms, for instance, or butterflies or certain viruses, where there is a lot of non-vertical transmission involved, possibly, you get delta plots as high as this also in biological data. So the idea of using a tree is not terrible. Actually, we can also look what happens after inference. We can look at the topological uncertainty in the posterior distribution. We sample the most likely topologies, and we look at their marginal probabilities, which is just relative frequency of the topology in the posterior sample. And if you look here, this is for the introit data for the big tree. The base factor between the best and the second best topology is more than 3. And if you're a doctor or in the social sciences, etc., you would know that base factors over 3 are generally, again, accepted as better than anecdotal evidence. So the best topology is substantially the best topology. It's not like you have 6 options and they are all super similar to each other. The difference between the first two is the placement of the sources from Paris and the attachment of the Italian clade with respect to the French ones, which is exactly where we saw that the posterior is kind of uncertain, right? The support on 54%. Actually, we also ran this inference with the parsimonious methods instead of the Bayesian fancy ones. And it turns out that the parsimony is really kind of useless here. We still get the eastern branch, but everything else, the sensible structure, just completely disappears. The parsimonious models are not good enough for resolving this data. And this is very often the case. They work on toy examples, but once you get some real data sets, the parsimonious models break. Just an aside. You can actually plot your topological uncertainty. This is becoming an ad for Bayesian phylogenetics, but I mean, if they sponsored me, I would take the sponsorship in a YouTube video, right? I really think it's a cool toolkit. So you can also visualize your posterior like this. I've marked the root locations where they actually were inferred, but we'll get to that. So we can see, again, this low support node, there is some topological uncertainty associated with that, right? You can draw multiple different attachment points for this subclade from the posterior. We see a lot of uncertainty around Bohemian manuscripts in the Christmas data. Again, this makes sense. Most of them are 15th century stuff. They are from a very small area. I would be very suspicious of a model that would be able to resolve them. And this is just based on 500 nodes. And out of these 500, maybe only 100 are actually informative. If you remember, right, what's an informative position in an alignment for phylogeny. So this is like, the uncertainty here is expected. If we did not get a lot of uncertainty there, I would be very suspicious of my priors. Okay, hopefully I have convinced you that phylogenies are a good workable model of Gregorian chant melodic transmission. What about the dialects? How do we find them? Again, we can just eyeball it. You've already kind of seen that the Cistercians have a strong institutional identity and the rest is place of origin, right? But we can actually prove it in the spirit of higher standards of proof than musicology is used to. We go to something called phylogenetic signal, which is just a way of correlating evolutionary distance according to a phylogeny and the similarity in some traits. And in our case, the traits are place, time, and institution of origin, or cursus in church speak. And there are, again, many formulations of how to measure phylogenetic signal for discrete and continuous traits. Long story short, we measured all of them. No, not all of them, but we took a bunch of the sensible ones and coded the place and time of origin in many different ways. And don't bother to read the tables, but it's just to show that we are not limited to one specific decision about how to define the regions. Right? What is Germany? What is northern France? What is southern France? We did a bunch of possibilities and then averaged or combined the scores, not just point averaging, but combined the scores across all of them. And the results are exactly what we got by eyeball, fortunately. So time is unrelated. There are no new or old versions of melodies. This is kind of surprising because this is across a couple hundred years and there is a lot of musical development going around chant. Right? The whole polyphony thing, for instance, happened in churches a lot, but still, Gregorian melodies don't really evolve in time. Place, though, is consistently relevant. The Cistercian networks are an exception, but they paid a lot of attention and they expended a lot of effort to make sure that they would not be subject to the tyranny of distance. It cost quite a bit, right, to go from like a Polish monastery to this place in France and back, and it was a lot of effort that they spent on making sure the melodies are exactly right. So for them, the institution of origin is more relevant than geographic point of origin, but for the Benedictines or for the canons regular, they don't care. They are just taking the melodies locally. We should do this with some other monastic orders down the road, but in principle, this already fits quite well with historical realities as far as we know. Mostly this confirms some previous assertions about melodic dialects, but it confirms them with a methodology that is extensible, and it only took us 3 years to get to these insights like east, west, blah, blah, blah. It took the musicologists or monks actually at a specific monastery. It took them decades to come with these insights. This is much faster and much more detailed, actually, and replicable and extensible, etc., etc. So it's quite an innovation in this sense. Okay, so we did the dialects thing. What about the transmission history? We have the tree shapes. What about the transmission map? What do we actually need to go from topology to history? We need to get back to the concept of branch length. So currently, the branch length represents just evolutionary distance, which is how related are these or unrelated. And this conflates two things. One is the rate of change, and the other is time. So how quickly am I evolving in this environment, and how much time I have to evolve. And in order to go and anchor sort of our model in historical time, we need to separate this out, right? That's the interesting bit here. And fortunately, this is something that especially the people who do dinosaurs, this is what they have had to deal with because they are interested in specific historical times. There is this thing called divergence time estimation, which is a method exactly for what we need. It does require selecting a root, which this is why we do Bayesian methods. This is just estimating another marginal distribution and we're fine. And once we run DTE, then we actually get not only evolutionary distances, but we get a history. This would be pretty cool. Okay, the root selection was only actually a partial success. So for the Christmas data, it worked like a charm. It was amazing. We like jaws dropped because very convincingly it selected this branch as the one where to place a root. Like selecting a root means you select a branch in the unrooted tree and you say, aha, in here. I split this one in two and that's where my root is. I take it like this and you right up. And this was great because Metz is very close to the Rhine, and this is all east, and this is all west of the Rhine. So this looked like magic. Like science never does this, right? Work at first try. Well, it turns out on the introits data, the situation was a lot more messy, and probably here we just got lucky with the balance of Western and Eastern manuscripts. And we need to figure this out a bit better. So for the introits, we got root positions in places where it really doesn't make historical sense. So we admit that this did not work as well as we thought it would. And then we just manually rooted the trees on the Rhine again, because that at least makes a little bit of sense. Again, this is remarkably similar to what sometimes happens in biological data, where also sometimes you just select the root manually, because you know what your outgroup is, you know how your species are related to the rest of the living species, and you're only interested in some phenomena within this observed group. So you say, well, I know the root is here, and you just go on. But yeah, it's a fail in our situation. Something needs to be fixed. Then, after rooting, we ran divergence time estimation, and this is, for me, this is still black magic. Again, this is why if you do interdisciplinary work, actually make sure you have people from the other disciplines there, and that they have enough person hours to do technical work for you. So there is a bunch of priors called clock models that basically enable you to set the trade-off between rates of change and time it takes. They tell you stuff about whether, for instance, the rate of change downstream should or should not be correlated to the rate of change previously. This makes really good sense in some situations, like for instance, you have amphibians you have fish coming to land. Probably something about the speed of evolution on land will be correlated to this first radical step, because probably you get adaptive radiation, lots of new ecological niches to fill. So probably if the rate of change here is super high, it is also going to be super high down the road, at least for a while. Or you can have a fixed clock model, right? I'm in a very stable environment. The rate of evolution should be the same everywhere. This is the simplest one to infer, and it practically never works. We did the independent one, which is we say, well, any branch can evolve at any rate, and we just have some prior on the overall distribution of rates, like 4 different categories, inverse gamma distribution, blah, blah, blah. I really don't know enough about the details. It's dark magic. Does it work, though? Kind of. So we have the Christmas tree, we have the manuscripts west of the Rhine and east of the Rhine, the magically selected route right where it should be. And we inspected this branch, which is the one that evolves the fastest. And it really evolves much quicker than the others, right? It's not too visible, but if you look at it, on a screen, it's bright red. Everything else is kind of purplish. And what is going on here? So if you look at what manuscripts are downstream in history, this branch, they are all Bohemian. And what happened around the year 1400 in this part of the world? They burned a guy. There was the Hussite Reformation. So maybe this high rate of change reflects the presence of the Hussite Reformation, which did something to the melodies. We have seen hints that melodic and political identity is connected. After all, this was Charlemagne's idea, right? Well, some of his advisors, for sure. But here we might see this going on at a sort of smaller scale. But wait, this manuscript is older. That does not make sense. Well, if you look into the manuscript, you see that the parts related to Christmas melodies underwent some changes later. These are palimpsests, so these are places where somebody scratched out the original ink and wrote something new. And I'm not like 100% confident in this assessment, but 95, that these melodies were actually edited later in the 15th century, because as written on the first page of the manuscript, over some earlier melody from Christmas, this manuscript was taken before the Hussite Wars went off. It was taken from Vyšehrad and brought to Austria for safekeeping. And apparently there it was then modified, including the melodies, in the 15th century. So the thing is, the manuscript is misdated, right? It should have been after that point. Then the high rate of change would go down a bit because you don't have so much compressed. But hey, look, we looked at something weird in the model and found something historically interesting. Another cool thing to look at is the most recent common ancestor of Cistercian manuscripts. So the predicted median time of origin is the year 1145. And if you dig into the history of the Cistercian order, you will find that between the years 1140 and 1147, a certain Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was actually doing the Cistercian redaction of chant melodies. So even though there is some uncertainty associated with this, the historical model of chant transmission actually predicts this dead on. I mean, this is rare, but it's a cool thing. Like, there is potential clear here in recovering the transmission history of chant. On the introids, oh boy, okay, this is no longer such a happy story. So the problem is that if you look here at the Cistercian ancestor, it's 50 years early in the median age, and the 95% credibility interval is actually like 200 years. It's useless for anything historical. And all the variances on the node ages are like, there's nothing you can usefully learn from this. On the other hand, though, and this is the final point that I want to make, look at this. Again, we look at the fastest evolving branch. Again, it's way faster than everything else in the tree. What is going on here? Well, there is a Netflix series that's hiding behind this branch. And that Netflix series is the story of Arnold of Brescia. So this dude, born in 1096 or so, the disciple of Abelard, who was like this medieval French intellectual. And this Arnold became a bit of a reformer and had ideas like maybe the church shouldn't be so rich. It's a perennial favorite, right? So when the Bishop of Brescia was away, this dude started a revolt, and they did not let the bishop return for a couple of years. They took over the city. And this was in northern Italy. These were city-states. So basically, they took over a small state. The guy was a rebel. Eventually, he lost. He was exiled to France. Then he had to run to Bohemia. He was seriously hated by this St. Bernard of Clairvaux guy from the Cistercians. Like, whenever Arnold would find refuge, like somebody would offer him protection, a monastery or a noble somewhere, St. Bernard would write a very angry letter to that person saying, you know, you really should not be hiding this dude. So that's like season 2 of the series. And after a few years, he actually went to Bohemia. This place was so far from St. Bernard that nobody cared. So they let him stay here and let the tensions simmer down a bit. Eventually, Arnold was allowed to go back to Italy to offer penance to the Pope. So he went to Rome. Just so happens that in Rome in 1146, there was a Republican revolt going on. And that's season 3 of our story. Arnold joins the revolt, becomes its leader, kicks the Pope out of Rome. That's where the Netflix story ends, because after that he's actually executed. But anyway, again, we have a pretty cool thing. Something extreme in the model, something unexpected, actually reflects extreme historical circumstance, which I think is a pretty fruitful, possibly pretty fruitful point, again, of like interdisciplinary collaboration and a way of using these models beyond their original design. Of course, we can do this not just with melody. We have stuff waiting for interpretation that's inferred on chant repertoires, blah, blah, blah. We have a large data set. Actually, we're looking for collaboration. If you have a little bit of time and if you think this is cool, then I have some money. And that's it. So melodic dialects of Gregorian chant were pretty conclusively shown to exist. They follow geographic patterns rather than temporal patterns. The institution of origin matters only for some institutions, if they actually cared. More broadly, phylogenetics for chant works, or works well enough to explore down the road, even though it doesn't work always, as with the divergence time estimation for intrace data. Maybe we can really map a shared layer of European cultural history with this. Maybe we can introduce our colleagues from the humanities and liturgy studies and musicology, etc., to model-based thinking. And maybe eventually we advance the understanding of cultural evolution in music in our one of our essential periods of European identity forming. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you had fun.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid that you spent most of the time talking, so we have just a couple of minutes for questions. But Honza is here in this building every day, I should say. So any questions can be posed after. But just if there are questions right now, may have time for 1 or 2.
Thank you for this very nice question, very informative. I have a naive question. So you were talking about chant, and it looks like a well-behaved form or whatever, right? So which can be really followed and modeled by computational methods. So are there any like more forms behaving like this, which you will focus on in your future research, or it is sort of like exception that it's sort of well-behaved?
Chant is exceptionally well-behaved. I expected a lot more trouble, actually. The fact that this worked surprised me. The tree-likeness results show kind of why this works, that it really is exceptional compared to other traditions. People have been using phylogenies for really diverse data, for instance, for the knotting, for those string figures, and for folk tale variants, which actually has been criticized because they're this phylogenetic model with like diversification through time is not necessarily the thing to do. So there you start needing phylogenetic networks and more complicated models. I would like to be able to do something like this for folk musics, especially globally. There are nice cross-cultural studies that show that musical diversity, in some sense, is independent from linguistic and genetic diversity, so that music globally reflects like a different layer of cultural connection, let's say, and structure than language or genetics, which means ethnicities and stuff like that. But actually applying these methods meaningfully to folk musics is kind of hard, because chant is quite exceptional, actually, in this sense. So where you do get work that applies such methods to material which is not so nicely well behaved, what you get is that you sort of talk to the people who are already convinced that it makes sense to apply such models. Chant is a really good opportunity to convince people who are not yet sold on the idea of modeling things that you can get useful things, which is why for me this is so fun. And then I can go to chant conferences and talk about this and not get tomatoes thrown at me. But if I went with these models to an ethnomusicological conference, there would be tomatoes, because the model applies much less well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question and for the answer. And I just want to close the session today by saying that we will meet next Monday, and we will have a guest here from University of Edinburgh, and we will learn how learning and use shape evolving linguistic systems. So we'll pass from music to language. So thank you again for coming, and see you next time.
Thank you.